And now the Joust cards.
I am undefeated.
Jousting is kind of a new mechanic. There's no keyword for it, but there's a lot of cards that share this theme. Enough that I would call it a new mechanic, basically. This mechanic was seen in Magic before. It's a bit different because you compared the top card of your deck to the top card of your opponent's deck, but it was the same. You just compared which card cost more, and if yours did, you got a benefit. Same thing here, and I think this works well in Hearthstone. And it works really well as a jousting theme. And I hate to be the Debbie Downer here. I hate to be the one bringing people down. But when these set of cards are released, there is such a outcry of joy. It's like, yes! Finally, we punished these face decks. Control decks get something. Yes! But I have some bad news. It turns out that having done the math, you don't win the joust that often, even with a bigger deck. So here's some quick numbers for existing decks of if they were to joust existing decks right now without being specifically designed to take advantage of the joust mechanics, how they would roughly fare. So I think we can agree that Handlock and Control Warrior would be some of the more expensive decks right now. In terms of mana cost. If they joust against Face Hunter, which is one of the lowest mana cost decks in the game, then they win about 80% of the time. And you can kind of lump Druid into that mix too, especially if it's Ramp Druid. When that Face Hunter goes into the Hybrid Hunter, which is a mix of the Face Hunter cards and the Mid-Range Hunter cards, that percentage drops to about 66%. And if you actually go up against the mid-range hunter, that percentage drops to somewhere between 50 to 60%. So even against the scumbag hunter deck, well, mid-range isn't that scummy, but you still only win the joust 60% of the time if you're playing like a top-end deck. And the reason behind this is because you don't win ties, number one, and number two, you still have to run some low-cost minions in your high-end decks. For example, Handlock has Ancient Watchers, Owls, and Sun Furies. Warriors have Armor Smiths and Cruel Taskmasters. Druids have possibly that new 2-mana card. They have Shades. Actually, Druid is in one of the best spots. Now, you could remove those cards if you wanted to take advantage of the joust mechanics for the extra percentages. But then the problem happens of, what if you're not facing off against the face deck? If you're facing off in the mirror deck, your chances of winning the joust are substantially lower than 50%, specifically because ties do not work in your favor. So then you have to make a consideration of what percentage odds would you be willing to take the joust at? And that's going to differ based off of the base stats of every minion. But yes, naturally, the joust cards will be better if the meta is super aggressive. Will it ever be aggressive enough that there won't be any mid-range or control decks for you to fail jousting against? Some people have argued, okay, with the joust mechanic, you actually get to see a minion that was in the opponent's deck, and then you can get a little bit of insight into their deck. But here's the thing. Eventually the metagame will settle down enough to where you should be able to tell roughly what type of deck your opponent is playing by the time you actually play any of these joust cards. So I don't think that's a big deal. And it is a minion and not a spell, so you can't even really see the flavor because spells are usually more telling. Furthermore, they get to see one of yours too, so the information exchange is roughly the same. It would probably be slightly to your advantage if you were a control deck, to know more about your opponent's deck than your opponent knows about you, since you're usually the one dishing out the answers. But the fact that you can see a random card, a random minion from your opponent's deck is very minimal. Also, on a somewhat obscure note, in case anyone asks, if you joust and you have no minions in your deck, you automatically lose. And if you joust and your opponent has no minions in their deck, you automatically win. And like I hear you guys on the, you can like see specific things, but you have to find exactly that one minion that gets revealed, which is their tech card, out of like 10 to 20 minions. That's like virtually no advantage. And it's like an argument, oh, you know a minion that's not in their hand, that's not really a thing. So that said, let's take a look at the first card, Gadgetzan Jouster. 1 mana 1/2, or 1 mana 2/3. 1 mana 2/3, really good. 1 mana 1/2, really bad. So you better win the joust. So what cards are you going to win? Are you going to want to win the joust against? Well, of course, if you've put the Gadgetzan Jouster in your deck, you think that the meta is all face decks. Face Paladin, face Hunter, face Rogue, face Warrior, whatever, face something. But against those decks, you don't really care about their health, so you would want to put in Zombie Chow. So this is the downside of Gadgetzan Jouster. Originally when I saw this card, I was pretty excited. I was like, okay, 1 mana 2/3 against the decks that are scummy. That's great. Wait, but I've already started cutting Zombie Chow because there aren't that many face decks. I should just run Zombie Chow. And that is the story of how I came to not think that Gadgetzan Jouster was any good. Because I want a 1 mana 100% 2/3. And at what percentage would I be willing to like risk sometimes getting a 1/2 in order to avoid the 5 health? And really, with the decks that would run Zombie Chow, the heavy control decks, they really don't even care about the opponent's health that much. Like 5 health sometimes matters, but really not that much. And not really worth it, I think. In Arena, I don't think you can reasonably get a mana curve which is that much higher to justify running Gadgetzan Jouster in any deck. 1 mana 2/3 is ridiculously strong in Arena, but the times where this is going to be a 1 mana 1/2 is just too high. If you were to run across the same exact mana cost deck in Arena, you only have a 40% chance of winning the clash, and that's because ties count against you. So you're going to tie like about 20% of the time, in other words. Even if your mana costs are like 1 entire average mana higher, even in the case where your average mana cost, and that's like saying you are only running 1 2-drop in your Arena deck, and then like basically instead of running 6 2-drops, you're running 6 3-drops, which is completely unrealistic. Even in that case, against the average Arena deck, with the mana curve, you have a 60% chance to win the brawl. And that's not a lot. So the odds are not in your favor, basically, even if you have a deck with a higher mana cost. But that said, there might be some kind of deck in Constructed that lets you get away with not running those 2-drop minions, and then you win jousts a lot more often to possibly justify it, but never for Gadgetzan Jouster, just because he would run Zombie Chow. Argent Lance, Paladin weapon, 2 mana 2/2, or sometimes a 2 mana 2/3. So the card to compare this with would be Coghammer. Is it worth an extra mana, in the base case scenario for the Argent Lance, to give a minion Divine Shield? And that probably is worth it. So it turns out that even if Argent Lance gets the win in the joust, Coghammer is debatably better, but that isn't to say that a 2 mana 2/3 weapon is without merit. 2 mana 2/3 weapon doesn't exist in the game, other than Stormforged Axe, which isn't played at all and actually costs 3 mana. Paladins are already kind of flooded with weapons. For 3 mana, they get the Coghammer, or they get the Muster for Battle, which is 1/4. Just doesn't seem like it would be able to bust through either of those. If you're going against rush decks, they often have 1 health cards, which you just Muster for Battle, lights Justice away, and you run that Coghammer anyways. If this were always a 2 mana 2/3, it might be worth considering, but just because of the odds, especially in a Paladin deck, hey, maybe Dragon Paladin is going to be a thing, and you put in the Argent Lance. Like, that would probably be the deck where this fits in. Even if you get the 2 mana 2/3, I don't think it's that good. In Arena, though, 2 mana 2/2. That does kill 2 3/2s, and you have a chance of it making a 2 mana 2/3. And there aren't that many weapons in Arena, so I think in Arena this will actually be pretty good. We got a Jousting Warhorse here. Compared to Lost Tall Strider, It's got 1 less health, and Untitled Strider is obviously a very bad card. But I will note that a 4-mana 5/3 with charge would be insane in an aggressive deck. Now here's the bad news. Face decks can't run this card because it won't have charge. And control decks don't want this card because they're basically spending 4 mana to deal 5 damage. And you only get the chance at doing that. Even if you were to like play this as a replacement for Arcane Golem in that handlock deck, which goes Arcane Golem, power, overwhelming, faceless, you can't possibly risk your minion not having charge on the Armored Warhorse. So, unfortunately, no good. In Arena, I think this card is actually competitive with Untitled Strider because the chance that you get the charge off, which is going to happen like if your mana curve is about the same as the average, it'll happen about 40% of the time. It'll be better than Untitled Strider, just because 4 mana 5/3 of charge is quite good. The thing about Construct is that usually cards serve a very specific purpose. So charging means you want to deal as much damage to the face as possible, but the very concept of these jousting cards is that you need a heavy control deck, which usually doesn't want to deal 5 damage to the face, and then 4 mana 5 damage removal isn't that good, and sometimes you don't get the removal, so it's bad. Tuskarr Jouster. Now here's a Jouster that actually might work out. I like the card because it is a control card, since it restores health. The reason why this Jouster works out is because it's a 5 mana 5/5, so the stat baseline is actually good enough to kind of justify it. Easiest to compare this card to Anti-Killbot, which is a 5 mana 3/3, always restore 8. This one restores like 1 less, but it gets +2/+2 in stats, which is a really big deal. The interesting thing is like Paladin decks almost wanted to run 2 healbots. Like I almost wanted to run 2 healbots at times in my mid-range Paladin deck, which by the way I think this card fits pretty well into, or the Control Paladin even. I would consider running 2 healbots in there too. Now instead of having the tough choice of running 1 or 2 healbot, you just run 2 Tuskarr Jousters, and sometimes you lose the joust and you're kind of sad, but possibly a majority of the time you win it. It's probably about 50-50 to be honest. If you run mid-range Paladin, Tuskarr Jouster, and you go up against Face Hunter, you have a 75% chance of getting it to restore the health. You have a 42% chance in the mirror of it working, and then against like the heavy control decks, Handluck, Control Warrior, Druid, you have about a 30% chance. But the good news is against those decks, you weren't really looking for the health, you were just looking for stats. So this is actually the kind of card which can work. It just needed like a good enough base stat line such that it didn't just completely fail. The bad news is this is in the 5 mana slot, which is kind of tough because that's where your Quartermaster is and your previous healbots were. But the good news is you can just replace a healbot with a Tuskarr Jouster. And because you probably want some element of healing, you would probably want 2 Tuskarr Jousters or 1 Tuskarr Jouster and a healbot. But yeah, I think this card will see play, specifically in mid-range and control. In Arena, this card will be pretty good because 5 mana 5/5 is reasonable. And you get the bonus of sometimes getting health. It'll probably average out to restore 3 health. So you can think of this as on average, you get a 5 mana 5/5 which restores 3 health to your hero. And that's not terribly exciting, but it's kind of okay. The Skeleton Knight. That one's a fun, recurring theme, very similar to Anubarak. It keeps coming back if you win these jousts. If you don't win the joust, then it's 6 mana 7/4. The 6 mana 7/4 is real bad. So you then start thinking about, okay, what if it's a 6 mana 7/4 that draws a card? Is that worth it? Probably doesn't work. Stat line is just a bit too weak. And it gets BGH'd. Sometimes you fail the joust and then rip your 6 mana 4 health minion. It's kind of an example of how, if you're jousting, either the joust effect needs to be really good or the stat baseline needs to be at least somewhat reasonable. So no good. In Arena, this just costs too much and it's a salty dog, which costs 1 more, which sometimes doesn't get you a card. I will say in Arena, if the effect goes off, then you've actually got a pretty good card, but you can't count on it. I don't actually know how this interacts with Baron. I would expect you just get 2 chances. And before you get any thoughts, the Baron Rivendare Skeleton Knight combo is not real. Master Jouster! 6 mana, 5/6. That stat line is just a little bit too weak. You can get a Taunt and Divine Shield if you win the Joust. It turns out, unfortunately, that a 6 mana, 5/6 Taunt Divine Shield is only +1/+1 from a Sunwalker. At what percentage of Jousts won would you ever put Master Jouster in your deck instead of Sunwalker? So, the Sunwalker's purpose is to be anti-aggro. Master Jouster serves that purpose when you're up against aggro. And to be fair, the taunt doesn't matter as much, but the Divine Shield is pretty important against control decks. So, at what percentage would you want to joust against a deck? And I'm going to arbitrarily say, I think I would have to be like 80 to 90% sure that I would win to put this card over Sunwalker. Yeah, I wouldn't put Sunwalker in most of my decks. And you can't actually even win 80 to 90% of the time usually. Even against the faciest of decks, you only max out at around 80% with a reasonable mana curve. Of course, you can make your mana curve like completely ridiculous and then always win these jousts, but then that's no good. In Arena, this might work out. The Sunwalker will be better, but this might be like an average-ish card. Well, that was fun. A lot of new cards. I think I was not too optimistic about any of them, but I think this batch is showcased a lot more cool stuff.